Okay, so I just greeted everybody that's here in person, but this is me greeting you online. My name's Lauren. I'm one of the psychologists at CATS, and we are here today for our last installment of the Summer Learning Series. For a little bit of housekeeping, if you are seeking continuing education for a license or a mental health practice license, MFT, psychologist, LCSW, I need you to sign in, and I've got 2 clipboards on the side. Give me your name, your license, and your email. Dr. Judy Prince will email out an evaluation after today's presentation, and then you'll get a certificate or the proof of your continuing education. If you are on Zoom, let me know in the chat that you are seeking continuing education, and same thing, you'll get an email with the evaluation, and Dr. Prince will send you your certificate. And you do need to stay for the entire 2 hours. Mark gave me his word that he will not go past noon. There will be no breaks, so if you need to take care of something, please excuse yourself. And questions. So Mark will take some breaks throughout the presentation to ask for questions for those of you here in the room. And that's when I'll be monitoring the chat. So if you have questions and it's not getting answered, just be patient and we'll try and get to it when we can. Okay, what else? How about today's topic, bringing a recovery model to college mental health. So this is Mark's parting words of wisdom based on his experience in his career and his time here at CSU Long Beach. So here's an overview of today's topic. As things have gotten more complex and overwhelming in student mental health, many places have increasingly turned to an illness-focused medical model, including integrated care and wellness. This model has not worked well in public health as we have dealt with similar problems. There is an alternative movement in public mental health, the recovery model. This learning session will provide an argument for why the recovery model is a better fit for college mental health needs. Recovery model transformations, practices in community mental health, and applications to college mental health will be addressed. Did I get that right? Is that what we're
Sounds good.
Okay. And a little bit about Dr. Mark. I know we all know him, but here's an overview of how he likes to introduce himself. Dr. Mark is a recovery-based psychiatrist. After 27 years working as the medical director at the MHALA Village in Long Beach, California, which is an award-winning model of recovery-based mental health care, he moved on in 2017 to be the only psychiatrist at the CSU Long Beach, providing innovative psychiatric services for students. He continues to work as an independent trainer, consultant, speaker, writer, and transformation leader in the mental health recovery movement. If you have questions after today's presentation, the best way to get a hold of Mark is by email. He's got 2 more weeks here. So his last day is Friday, August 5th. So get your questions in soon. And he did give me permission to share his slides after. There's one video in the presentation. So those of you that are online, you'll be able to hear it. The video quality is not going to be that great, but you'll have the link afterwards so you can watch it on your own time. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Mark.
Thank you. It was supposed to be the way I want to introduce myself. You left off like incredibly good looking. So this presentation was, I did it at ACHA conference. The idea was I'd spent 5 years here trying to apply the stuff I learned before coming here, but I came and put it together for a presentation at the conference in San Diego. And then a few people said, well, can you do it? Can you give the presentation here for us? We were at the conference, yes. And actually Damien was at that presentation and asked, hey, can you do it here as well? You may have noticed this first slide includes not just my name, but Jim Proper's name, who I presented this with. I decided to include his name here because he's a voice that's really important in the recovery movement, community mental health, that is rare in college mental health. He's the voice of lived experience. He's someone who, when he was in college, had a bunch of experiences that were called psychotic, that he still wanted a spiritual or psychotic. He thought he had powers to jump off a building. He had suicide attempts, hospitalizations. And he uses those experiences really openly to help other students who are going through something similar, extreme experiences, to say, hey, I've been there, let me be a guide alongside you. Now that voice of a lived experience peer working with you, that's super important in substance abuse. Almost every substance abuse counselor does that. It's even kind of important in the world of physical rehab. You see people like in wheelchairs helping other people in wheelchairs or blind people. You see this sort of this lived experience. I've been there, so I can tell like it is. In mental health, that's been something was originally left up entirely. Wait a minute. If you have a mental illness, your own problems, don't go into this field to fix yourself. You're damaged. That, of course, has not stopped lots of people with issues from coming into the field, but then they keep it secret instead of using it and create a lot of extra issues. Only more recently, we've been, wait a minute, those issues are part of your source of compassion, be part of your healing, and we want that same role here as well. So I include his name, one, because that voice, I think, is a voice that we don't have in mental health at colleges hardly at all. And because I kept a few of his slides along the way. By the way, once again, harkening back to Damien showing up the presentation a couple months ago, he was impressed enough by Jim's voice. He went up and created business cards and said, hey, when we're doing some training for our new staff working with the police group, I want you to do some training on stuff, how it looks from your point of view to share the stuff you were sharing there. I'll try to share a few of his points along the way, but I've added a bunch of mine along the way too. All right, so first slide here. Now I want you to enjoy this first slide because it's the only one with any animation. It took me an hour to do in 3 YouTube videos. So, you know, you gotta pay close attention here. If you can sing along if you like. Da, 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 da. Aren't you impressed?
Yeah.
In case that was too hard to read. Here's a slide in normal. So the idea is that psychiatry has been trying to become a part of the mental community, and even psychologists, other parts of mental health, are trying to become medical model and do things. But wait a minute, it's been struggling out there in community mental health with many of the same issues we're facing too. Let's, instead of just taking them blindly as what's going on, think are there alternatives. And I'm saying the recovery model is an alternative. That is not being seen in college mental health hardly anywhere. I don't know how many of you saw Beth's quote in the article about the changes they're trying to do here. Said we looked around and no one's got a good model for dealing with all the increase in mental health issues that are happening. We know that the classic model of college counseling services is being phased out, is being moved away from, not because it isn't helpful, not even because it isn't popular, because it doesn't seem to be big enough for the wave of what's going on to actually deal with it. And that's causing to move more medicalized to things. I'm saying, wait a minute, before we do that, is there another way of doing things? I'm going to start by talking about what happened in the community mental health and then how they apply it to college mental health. So the first thing we say about this story, everybody knows. They have these mental health, these state hospitals, all do within asylums. They closed the asylums. They gave people lots of rights. They didn't put enough money into the community, these clinics, and all these people ended up on jails in the streets. And it's been a terrible disaster. Look how terrible this is. And we went too far on all these things. We need more hospital beds. We need a little bit less rights going on. We need more community clinics and doctors and things. You guys have heard this same story thousands of times. How many of you believe this story? How many think this is true? None of you think it's true? It's a story. I told this story to my local congressman. I said, you know, I'm not sure it's true. He said, wait a minute, is that just you who doesn't think it's true, or is that everybody? So I've read that everywhere. It must be true. We've been sold this throughout. And I want to start with, let's look at the little of the foundations of that story. make room for other stories, because that story controls the airwaves. When Newsom says, I want to make care courts, he's building on this story. Every story you see about homeless people in the Times, they're building it on this story. Now, you guys probably don't know Dr. Richard Lamb. He was my best supervisor when I was in residency at USC. He died a few years ago in his 90s. Still a passionate advocate for community mental health. But you do know his line there. LA County is the largest mental health hospital and mental hospital in the whole country. That's just so pithy, so wonderfully put it together that it's captured our imaginations. This is, wow, that must be true, and it's repeated over and over again. Let me tell, I did know Dr. Leonard, my best supervisor. Let me tell you a little about who he was, and more importantly, the perspective he comes from. He began his career before going to medical school as a psych tech in the old state hospitals, in the era when they did ECT, lining up people to do shock therapies or lobotomies or this sort of thing. And by the way, he was not horrified or turned off or thought this was disgusting. He actually was an advocate for asylum, for having places for people to go to. He advocated for building the IMDs for people to go to. This may be a function of the kind of terrible things you're used to. You get a nerd to and don't seem that bad versus ones you're not. Like today, we're totally a nerd to the suffering of homeless people everywhere. I mean, it's been our whole life like this. But he did not see terribleness in mental health. What he didn't like actually were psychoanalysts. At that point, every psychiatrist had to do their own analysis and become psychoanalysts for any good. It was one of the perks of the job of working at the state hospital in New York. You got your psychoanalysis paid for. And he hated that mumbo jumbo and being told what to do and all this stuff and things. Although strangely enough, he was like a caricature of a psychoanalyst in the New Yorker. He had his pipe that he was messing with in all our supervision sessions like this. He believed heavily in biological diagnosis. He believed these were terrible burdens that you do not recover. He believed you do not empower them to have their own beliefs. The doctor needs to make decisions for you. You can't handle the stress of the world. You need protections. You need a sound. You need taken care of. You are a burden on your family. Not the family caused this. You're a burden on them. He was a passionate advocate for NAMI. Brought NAMI speakers to us as residents. This. And that's the background he comes from. He never believed in recovery. You don't get over it. And so when he walks into the LA County Jail, and this is an amazingly courageous thing to do, there aren't mental health services at the time. He walks in there with those glasses on. He sees a whole stack of people with mental illnesses in a crummier institution than the one he used to work in. The same kind of people, crummier institutions than he used to work in. And he says, I see the largest mental hospital anywhere in the country. And that vision has carried forth in every newspaper article and everything today since. Now, what if he had a different glasses on? What if he was someone who was really into child trauma? What if this was Bessel van der Hoek going there? He would have said, look at the display case of the effects of childhood trauma and neglect in our society that end up stuck here in jail. You know, the vast majority of both men and women were sexually abused or in jail. What if he was someone who cared about education? He'd say, you know what, the average reading level here is the 3rd grade, and the factor that correlates best with being imprisoned and getting stuck back in again, reincarceration, is illiteracy. What if he was someone who thought about drugs and the war on drugs? Think, look at this, we got the response to the war on drugs. 90% of everybody in the jail either has a substance use disorder or was high or drunk when they were arrested, or both the men and women. What if he was someone who cared about subsidized public housing? They say, look, these are a bunch of homeless people. 80% of the women in our jail are homeless. How is this for criminals that it's all homeless women who can't no place to stay because we got rid of the projects and made welfare so low they couldn't pay for it? Or maybe if he was someone who had looked through lens of racism, he'd say, wow, all these are people of color, and this has to do with racism and, you know, financial things and going on in our country. He didn't have any of those glasses. He saw the largest mental hospital in the world. Why is this important? Because if you walking with those glasses, you think the solution to today's problems is rebuild some hospital things, lower people's rights, build some care courts, get to our clinics better funded, more medications, even involuntarily if needed to help these people in the community. If you come with any of those other glasses, you might come with a whole other set of things you think we should be doing. A whole other set of solutions. Think what we're going to get to, think when you look at our college students struggling. If you wear the same glasses he's wearing, oh my goodness, we have epidemics of mental illnesses going on here. Or do we have a whole bunch of other things that those glasses blind us from? This graph, I actually saw it first about 10 years ago, but I recently saw it again 6 months ago in a book called Healing by Thomas Insel. Thomas Insel worked for, he was the head of NIMH for like 12 years, biological psychiatrist, and now he's Gavin Newsom's trying to help figure out what to do with mental health things in California. He recently wrote a book, and the book begins with this same story. They close the mental hospitals, and here's the graph he uses to prove it. Now, the first time I saw this graph, like 10 years ago, there was a supervisor of mine showing it. I said, wait, we go back to that graph. There's something that bothers me about this graph. And you guys on Zoom are going to have to visualize this on your own here. The lines, if one going out of the hospitals turned into the people going into the prisons, shouldn't the lines cross like this? Why does this one go down first? And then 20 years later, this one starts going up and keeps going up while this one's relatively level. What the hell? These people did okay for 20 years and then we threw them in prison. What were they doing in that 20 years? Shouldn't though, if that really is, people left the hospitals, went to jail, why don't the lines cross in the middle? How do they make it in between? What's going on there? I say, I don't know, don't worry about it. It's true. About 5 years later, someone else came up to me and said, you know something else about that graph? These people in the hospital, the majority of them were white women nationwide. Very few of the state hospitals were women and mostly white. These people over here in prison and on the streets, not so much white women. They're anything but white women. Vast majority are men of color, of course. So wait a minute, we closed the hospitals, we let out the white women, they miraculously 20 years later turned into men of color in the jails. What? And when I read this in this book, I noticed one other thing. You see these, they got two different scales. If we use the same scale, if we put 2,500 at the top here and 500 down here, this line would be about here. And it would go down slightly like this. We built way more prisons than we ever had hospitals. A small hill of white women 20 years later turned into a giant mountain of men of color. That's the proof? I think that graph proves the opposite. What are we missing here? What else happened in 1980 that made things go up dramatically like that? The first thing that occurs to me is 1980 is, for anyone who's older than me, is when Ronald Reagan became president. And one of the things he did was he closed the housing projects. These were huge public federally funded housing projects. They were terrible, by the way. Terrible crime. Children did really badly, corruption. The one in St. Louis, opposite where I went to medical school, the police wouldn't even go into, it was so terrible. Gangs ran the whole thing. The Hell's Angels tried to police it for a while. And he said, enough of that. Let's close that. And he said he made HUD vouchers. We have today. You go get scattered housing. But what they rarely tell you is when they did that, they took 90% of the money out of the system. What if the story was, we closed the housing projects and the money didn't follow into the community, and as a result, they ended up on the streets and prisons? Average length of time right now to get a housing voucher, if you are determined to be a person of highest need, vulnerable on the streets, is 1.5 years. If you're not vulnerable or in need, it's 200 years so waiting for it. So you don't move on the list at all. Never mind. What else happened there? When I did this presentation a while ago with a group of police, they all yelled out, the war on drugs happened. Also began under Reagan in 1980. Notice, by the way, they didn't answer a pandemic of drugs happened or an escalation in the use of drugs. They said the war on drugs, our response to drugs changed. And third, we began cuts in the welfare system at that point heavily. Things like any kind of welfare, SSI, AFDC, GR, they all have gone gradually down, especially in inflated dollars. Let me give you an example of this in real terms. In 1990, when I began working at the village, SSI, which is how much you get if you're disabled, never worked and paid in, was $630 a person. The worst, crummiest single apartment in Long Beach, in like kind of a crummy rundown place, was about $300 or $325. If someone was homeless, I helped them get SSI, and I said, all right, you get someplace to rent, and if you don't, 3 or 6 months from now, I'm gonna make you a payee, and then you'll have to get someplace to rent. We'll make you pay rent, you have $200 for food, another $100 for whatever you want. When I left there 5 years ago, SSI has gone up. It's now $940 a person. The cheapest, crummiest place in Long Beach to rent anywhere was about $1,200 a month. I can no longer say you get a place to rent in 3 or 6 months, or we're going to get one for you. It's upside down. There's no budget that works here at all. I have to say, get on that 1.5 year waiting list for this HUD and stay on the streets in between while you're waiting, just because you're disabled, because the amount they have in the system. The lines look the same for AFDC has gone down. A family of 3 now gets like $880 something. How does that pay for housing to live in? They've all gone down. The causes, if you start looking through these glasses, you might come with entirely different interventions for people with serious mental illness on the streets. Let's look at this from a mental health point of view for a minute. Carl Bell was a young, black, really bright psychiatrist. He was very outspoken, south side of Chicago, around a huge place. He was friends with like Oprah and Obama and stuff. He also died a few years ago, just in his 60s. And he once showed me a slide. I don't have his graph to steal, so I made one up. That has risk factors and protective factors. So the first thing he says, the more bad things happen to you, the more mental health symptoms you get. Anybody except the most biological psychiatrists agree with it. You have a bunch of terrible things and things get worse in your life. You start having more and more symptoms. He said, but that's in the absence of protective factors. If you have protective factors, the line is almost flat. Even if bad things happen to you, you don't get that much mental illness following along because you've got some protection. I'm like, well, what are protective factors? And he starts with this list over here when he's talking about kids at this point. You got enough money to make it through the month and a little extra for emergencies. So, if your car goes out and you get $300 repair, that doesn't cost you your car and your job and your house and your kids taken away. You have a reasonably secure place to live that you certainly count on. You've got some family support. This doesn't have to be a perfect family or functional, but just some family that cares about you. You have other caring adults around as a protective shield, maybe some teacher, or a coach, or a minister, or a therapist, or something like this. And do you have a role or identity in life besides being a bad kid or a mentally ill kid or a messed up kid? Like I'm I'm a runner, I'm an artist, the nerd, I'm a reader, I'm an animator. You have some identity. Now, to those two I've added, more for adult groups, you have some kind of spiritual practice or beliefs. People who say, God will take care of me, things will be all right, they tend to do kind of better. And people who have psychological and emotional strengths, you handle things better, you're more emotionally capable, you do things better. So if you look at this theory of mental illness, it says risk factors turn into symptoms when you don't have protective factors. You could argue the real story of what happened with homeless, jail, mentally ill people is we systematically destroyed all the protective factors, so all the risk factors turned into illnesses. All the risk factors turned into symptoms, all the risk factors turned into distress. By the way, it isn't all the government's fault. Families have deteriorated over time, church supports have deteriorated over time, community deteriorated over time. We've got whole books written on a bunch of stuff, but our protective factors have gone down even aside from the government. But if you believe that this is true, that mental illnesses aren't just suddenly your biology goes wrong because of an imbalance, that stuff happens to you, that your protection and resilience isn't enough, so it comes through. To say what happened here was that those people were no longer protected and they fell apart. Before I leave this part, one last slide, because you might wonder, what really happened to those people in the state hospital? Those mostly white women, what happened to them anyway? This is a study, 1987, from Vermont. Courtney Harding is another person I know. She was a nurse, she had a couple kids of her own at the time. She was out of Yale, she's doing this study with a band going around. And the study group is the people in the state hospital in Vermont who were diagnosed with schizophrenia, and make sure they met modern day criteria too, who did not respond to Thorazine, who the doctor said, do not let out of here. And the governor said, I'm closing our hospital anyway. We'll give you a little service if we're closing the hospital. That's the group. She's got like 200 people who are schizophrenia, not responding to meds, and the doctors say, don't ever let out. And she goes finds them 30 years later. Must be easier to find people in New England than it is in Los Angeles because she finds like 90%. And what she finds, this is how they're doing. 83% haven't been in a hospital. They've got friends, even close friends. Half of them are working. People in the hospital who didn't respond to meds with schizophrenia who said never let out. Half of them are working. 3/4 have no symptoms or slight symptoms. 80% are meeting their basic needs. 3/4 are living a full life. Over half have slight or no impairment in their function. By the way, this study is 1987, before we took away all the protective factors. I don't know what happens if you do this study now because we're not closing any more mental hospitals. This study, even though it's published in a major psychiatric journal, no one ever criticized the methodology, it's done well, has never been part of anybody's study. Anyone ever seen this study before? It's hot off the press, it's 1987, how come you haven't seen it? Because they keep saying we close the hospitals, people end up in jail, but they don't include a study in what actually happened. They did the study and it didn't match what they thought it was going to do, so they blew her out of grand rounds in every psychiatric establishment since. And we keep retaining that same story and the same solutions that aren't going to work. All right, let me pause here for a minute, see if there's questions either here or on the thing, because if you don't get that story out from dominating your mind, I don't got any room to put any other stories in. So I got to break that one down and say, that's not what's actually going on, open perspective for some other stories. Questions or comments from you guys or from your set on?
No questions yet.
Yeah.
Why wasn't a study done? What do they do with all those people that when they live in the hospital? What happened to those people?
There's been very few studies of that because they're hard to do. Finding someone 20 years later and trace them all down. Whenever you do the study that looks like this, from the hospital or people with schizophrenia or anything, you end up with results that look like this, about 2/3 to 3/4 recovery. She actually replayed the study in Maine where they had no services, and they did not quite as good. About half of them recover, which those services can make some difference. But the only other study I know like this, by the way, we had a thing you could have people in the hospital indefinitely for dangerousness. So Patton was filled with all these people for dangerousness, and they changed it. You can only hold someone for 6 months or a year for dangerousness, and they had to let out. These are the people that doctor said, never, don't let them out, don't let them out, don't let them out. 95% of them did nothing dangerous after that. Well, what about the 5 who did? How many really lock up? You know, you can say what are the social implications, but even that one is the people we identified as too dangerous to ever let out of the state hospital. 95% weren't, they didn't do anything. It's the only other study I know of that looks like that is what happened when they closed it. There is one more recently out of Pittsburgh where they closed their state hospital and they followed it very carefully and moved people in the community, and they had great success. But one person killed someone. And strangely enough, they had enough community support there that did not sink the entire program. They kept doing it, and lots of people made it. You're gonna have, it's not this, no, you never get 100%. I don't care what your program is, you never get 100%. Something is bad from time to time, but you're gonna get these big numbers of people doing well. Those are the only other stuff I know off the top of my head. Any other? Did that explain?
I don't understand. If they showed that, what was the plan? What was the plan for the support that people need?
Some places had better plans and some had worse plans. Some had the same staff that were seeing you before, got jobs in the community. Philadelphia did it like that. Some places, well, the community centers. California actually had a whole set of, I forget what the name of it is, of case managers that followed these people around who worked in the community clinics. I would try to follow them around. Went on for about 10 or 20 years, following them around doing stuff, and eventually got defunded and stopped doing it. Because we stopped having people leaving the state hospitals. You don't meet hardly anybody who's spent 20 years in the state hospital.
The need is there, you can see it. I mean, it's people out, a lot of mental health going on,
So that's so this is your, thanks for thinking, this is exactly what I'm making, is it says, the fact that they're there, does that mean they need a hospital because that's what used to be what we did? Or does it mean, let's think of what else might work? What are the possibilities? Which is, unless it's like, oh, that's a great bridge to when they say what else kind of thing works around what's been done, what are the choices? Any other questions before I go on to the second half of that?
And the request is just that you repeat the question when it's asked. So
Oh,
that
okay.
no one-
Okay, got it. So for that one, the original question was, was there any other studies about people who got out of hospital, what happened to them? And then the follow-up was, hey, might they make better plans or do things for people? I mean, it's obvious they need to be back, they need something more, if not a hospital, what other choices you got? Mike, is that what you said?
I feel like they need shelter, they need food. If you don't have food, that triggers the way of thinking. I mean,
You need your protective factors,
yes.
perhaps. So the people themselves started telling their own stories. Their story didn't look like you let me out of the hospital with nothing and I fell apart. Their stories weren't even really very illness-centered stories. Their stories were about personal struggles. Were about trying to make it and overcome things, finding meaning in things, who helped me, who didn't help me, how I got through things, I made through things. There's a number of books like this of people who try to make it through various things. One of the first one was Judy Chamberlain here, wrote a book called Confessions of a Non-Compliant Patient. About what the things they did to try to make it. And many of these people in the early writing their own stories were really mad at psychiatry, really mad at the system. They didn't think, oh, please help me get in the hospital. They thought, you ruined my whole life locking me up. I can't stand this. How to get this? This is terrible. Just stay as far away from me as possible. I don't want anything to do with it. We'll try to help ourselves, maybe. When they said they're psychiatric survivors, they didn't mean they survived their illnesses. They meant they survived us. We'll take care, you guys are just mean. We're not going to go anywhere near you guys. And they made these projects to demonstrate and humanize their lives. Like, for instance, the cemetery project, was in the hospitals, they'd taken all the, when people died in the hospital for whatever, they took mass graves in the back unmarked. Let's find out who these people are. That's not even honoring their humanity. These were actual people who went there to die. The suitcase project that the pictures are up here. This is, you come to the state hospital, bring your suitcase, they put it up in there, stacks them, and you left your life and your pictures behind of your life, and you went on, maybe get out, maybe never get out, but you left your whole life behind like this. Isn't this really tragic? Aren't you really losing something by doing this? They wanted to emphasize how destructive this really was. So maybe we can help each other. You know, 12-step people help each other. They don't need like doctors now. They can do that fine. And even the first clubhouse was people who were let out of the state hospital in New York. They were really lonely. They started meeting on the steps of the New York Public Library, you know, where those big lions are from Ghostbusters. And after a while, some people noticed them there, and they get a little room in the library. And after a while, somebody donated money to a place called Fountain House. It became the first clubhouse, a place to hang out and have a place to be. So they started running their own programs. Fountain House won't let any psychiatrists in there, by the way. We'll do it ourselves. You just stay away. You let lots of people up and over-medicated. Some of them started running their own programs, warm lines, drop-in centers, homeless assistance programs, crisis programs. Some started working in regular mental health settings. Someone like Jim works at the College Counseling Wellness Center at Florida. Along the way, they became their stories. They became a huge influence of what was going on to amplify their story. This isn't so much the same story. There's other things too. Those hospitals were tragic. That wasn't what we really need to go back to. And they started forming something called the recovery movement. And they found a whole lot of people around willing to join in them who had been working on the edge of the system or kind of rebels in one way or another, who was trying to figure out how can we help these people besides the way the system's working, the system do it work. Examples. People who love civil rights joined us. You're right, you shouldn't take away your rights, you should do things with civil rights protection. Became a big part of the recovery movement. What's your human rights to this? People who are doing substance abuse recovery who have been doing it, helping each other. Finally, you guys are talking about recovery in the same way we are rapists, that you've always been like undermining us. People who were in trauma recovery. Trauma, often you think of, you'll work through your trauma and you'll recover. It's not like an illness. One of the reasons they don't put childhood trauma in the book is because it doesn't work in the illness model. It works in a recovery model. People who are doing psychosocial rehab. This is the way I got into this. You got people, you go, you know, they're still symptoms, but they want to go back to school and work and do things. Let's help them out. I don't want to wait till they fix your illness first. Let's see if you can do something this way. You know, let's tell Helen Keller, let's fix your eyesight and your hearing before you can work. Let's help you out. The people in the rehab movement. That's where I came in. It was rehab movement. The village was a rehab program trying to help people have lives, even if they still have a lot of symptoms. People who are big on cultural competence and cultural humility. What if you don't see this as a mental illness? What if you see this as a spiritual event, as a cultural thing, or something else? The medical model says, well, you're kind of ignorant. Let's teach you how to do this. How about just people who go, you know, the rules aren't working here very well. Your normal clinic really isn't working for homeless people. Your clinic really isn't working for transitional age youth. Isn't working for people who don't believe they have a mental illness. I want to work with them anyway. Let me figure out some other ways. For people, for staff who showed up for emotional reasons and then were forced to keep that hidden because your emotions aren't part of compassionately helping somebody. You're supposed to be a professional doing things on a professional, objective way. And last but not least, people who are in the field to do God's work. And before we make too much fun of that group, they ran the mental health system back in the 1800s when we were a very religious country. It's called moral treatment. There's these small places run by like Quakers and stuff. And they helped you get recovery if you have a mental illness, come there, and OT, occupational therapy, was invented at this time. Has some purpose. God finds, the devil finds work for I have little hot hands, so find your way back to God, sort of thing. By the way, they have a little data. 2/3 of people with psychosis recovered within 6 months and they were able to go home without symptoms. They've more successful than anything we've done since. And a lot of recovery looks like old moral treatment. treating people as though they have sacred souls, that everybody has some value and worth something. This is a big number of people, but they're all outsiders. So back to my Star Wars, imagine this is, these are the rebels, all in these are your Jedi masters and your Jedi knights hiding in various planets scattered around. This is a lot of people trying to figure out what to do, while the system keeps pummeling away with the same story. So what's the organizing vision? So it's the force of the recovery movement. This is from SAMHSA, which is a part of the Federal Government of Mental Health that does services, not basic research. They say the recovery is this process of change by which you improve your health and wellness, you've got a self-directed life, and you move toward your full potential. Most of this is a journey someone's on, a journey of growth, what happens to you. This is the way people describe their own lives. I started overcoming things. I got control of voices a bit. I learned what was going on. Like trauma, I worked through issues with my mom. I got some purpose in my life. I was able to stop other people's suffering. I gave back to others. I grew and got things thriving in my life. Not, I went to the doctor and got treated for my bipolar disorder and it was stabilized and put in remission. One is about the illness, one's about you as a person. Not that illnesses aren't part of this, because the four domains, one is how are you doing physically and mental health illnesses. You've got a place to live. It's extremely hard to have a good life on the streets. You've got purpose. Something you're about. When I see students here, one of the first things is, so what are you majoring in? What are you trying to be? What's your purpose? What are you trying to grow into? Where are you heading to? And do you have a community connection to people around you? Notice, by the way, that many of these are very similar to those protective factors I was showing before. Recovery is often about recovering protective factors or building yourself if they got lost along the way. And sometimes the process of recovering makes the illness get back under control as much as you got the illness and then you started recovering. So you start rebuilding these things. The journey people are on. Those of you who are the psychologists and therapists in this room will say, wait, that sounds way more of the way we do in therapy than trying to make a diagnosis and give you coping skills for your depression. That's, a deeper kind of therapy. That's what I really like doing. You may find yourself, wait a minute, maybe this is a better place for me than in the growing medical model. This is not, even though I'm describing it as these fringe places out there, this has credible responses. 2003, they did a President's Commission on Mental Health, first time since Carter. It was under George W., led by the Mental Health Commissioner for the state of Ohio. And they said, this system can't be fixed. We can't work like this. You've got to reimagine the whole system to a recovery-based system that includes all those things. You can't just give people pills and expect it to work out. Tom Insel, who I mentioned, he writes the book. He's a biological psychiatrist. He said, what the hell is going on? I did all this research. Why didn't it work out? Like cancer and infectious diseases, and people got better, people were worse than when I started spending the billions of dollars. He was highly influenced by Jim Sharon, who was the past director of the LA County Mental Health, who said recovery is people, purpose, and places. Go back to that slide before about recovery. Remember, it was home and connections and purpose to your life. The average clinic does not give you people to connect to, places to feel connected and live, and purpose in your life. You just went to a doctor's appointment or a therapy appointment. The most powerful people say we need, that was a striking finding in this book. He said, you know what? The medical model isn't going to work. We need to switch to a recovery model. What's really, lots of, well, I believe in recovery. Come on, you're just talking different words. Here's the three huge differences. And these are going to be important for applying it to college mental health, the differences along the way. One is, are you focused on treating an illness or helping a person have a better life? Are you focused on here's your coping skills for depression, or here's how to build your purpose and meaning and incorporate your depression as part of what makes you special and what you use to go forward with your life? It's about building a life or having less symptoms. And you may notice, the stuff in our plan that Beth and Damien were sharing with the PowerPoint is illness oriented. It's, so what's our treatments, and we start with, and what's our prevention, what's our wellness, so you have resilience, so you don't get ill. It's all around how do you handle this epidemic of illness that's coming. Not how do we help students grow. Second one is it professionally driven or client driven? Recovery is something the person themselves grows. They have to develop, they have to be empowered, they have to make decisions, they have to make choices, they have to grow themselves, pursuing their own goals. It can't be, I'm going to do recovery. Think back like the physical rehab of stuff. You can't say, I'm going to make you do your exercises to recover. No, you have to do the hard work to get there. You can't sit back and wait for my pill to fix it. And the third difference is it's strengths-based, not deficit-based. This isn't about cure. You're not going to fix everything wrong with everybody. This is how we're going to build your strengths and your resilience so you can make it through, both your internal strengths and your external strengths. About having those protective factors so you can handle things. Not how do I make sure you have no more symptoms. And all those quick set of examples. One is instead of locking everybody in hospitals, having outreach teams that go to where people try to connect you, get you start feeling more like a human again, find you some resources, help with the food, help with the place to stay, like my program used to do. And we got 2/3 of people then being able to live and do things in the community. Finding roles in clubhouses instead of sitting around with nothing to do all day. Hey, I'm the receptionist in the clubhouse. I'm the one that makes lunches for everybody. I'm the one who sends out our newsletter. I'm the one who puts the artwork up. I'm the one who makes the t-shirt factory in the back. I've got a purpose for being here. Not just come to your day treatment and your group therapy appointment, where I'll tell you what to do. Rebuilding a life, the people who are doing the rehab, how about supportive employment? So you still have symptoms, let's get your job anyway. You can work while you're very places. Supportive education, that's just what our BMAC group does. Housing, healthcare. Let's help you find meaning in things. So Terry Crisis Houses this was in the 70s, when there was a bunch of people laying around in the Bay Area who knew how to help people with LSD trips. They said, if you can help people with LSD trips, maybe you can help people with psychosis too. They made these little houses. Mosher was running NMX at the time, set this up, and they have people come there and you treat them as though you're going through a bad trip. Let's find meaning in your voices and stuff, and let me help you through this. And within a month or two, the vast majority didn't need beds, they didn't need the hospital, they were able to come out of it and do okay. This was so challenging to the system that he was made to step down as the head of NMX. Because the outcomes were better than hospital. Voice hearers is a group for, these voices aren't imaginary, they're real. I'm hearing them, they're real. What's the meaning of them? How am I come to terms existing with them? For me, is it connected to traumas? Is it spiritual things? Is it biological? Is it different sensitivities? What is this about? How am I going to come to terms with being around them when I find my own meaning in these voices, being supported by other people who won't judge me for hearing voices? And things like peer support, someone hanging out with you who's been through it before. I've been in the hospital about time before. I've been psychotic about the street. I'm with you. Or open dialogue was a way of helping families. If someone's psychotic, let me help you be able to stay connected, keep them going, so you don't have to go to a special program or a hospital locked up. So you keep them going while they're working through this to get out of it, keep their relationships going. See how every one of these approaches is at the person, is looking at them leading things and looking at their strengths, not at looking at illness based. Now, how many of you have actually seen any of these approaches being done? Well, our system doesn't look much like this. How many clubhouses are there in Los Angeles? Ever refer anybody to a clubhouse? Well, what does it have? So why am I picking on the medical model? What does it have to do with recovery? Because the medical model will only fund clinical illness-based things, will only fund hospitals and ACT teams and clinics and day treatments and things like that. They will make people act like patients instead of acting like coworkers or colleagues or something. They will make professional boundaries. Here's what comes into your psychologist as well. You guys have a bunch of professional boundaries and objectives, the way a patient or professional has to act and stay separately too. We can't like be friends or like a sponsor at AA. Professional liability makes us take the risk to be responsible rather than them being responsible for their own lives. So they're caretaken instead of growing. And it makes us accountable for only how did the symptoms do, not how their life do. And we tend to do them in little private offices. We're responsible for just our own casework, not how we're responsible for the whole community. Nobody says, how is a CAPS psychologist responsible for the entire mental health of the college things? How am I doing with my caseload? When we closed the state hospitals, we kept all the same staffing patterns, models, funding systems, all things. And that's the true story of these things didn't get built because they didn't match the model. Over the 30 years, here's a huge list of programs that work, that are very fringe, just weeds on the edges. My village program is basically gone now. These programs come and go on the edges, something not part of the system, not part of the. There's a true story that the main system keeps repressing these things on the edge because every one of these things are person-centered, client-driven, strength-based. All right, let me stop there at that moment because that's going to be kind of the talk about community mental health before we start about what's in colleges. Any questions or comments about the argument I'm making about that there do exist things that aren't fitting in the medical model, that don't fit in with what we're taught, or the airways, or the research money, or the funding money, or anything that's controlled by the medical model? Either I'm clear, or you want me to go to college, or you have enough already?
Mark, I'm gonna turn the light on to see if it helps.
That if you do just this one down, I think you can do just this bank down for keep the slides. You guys still see the slide? Yeah. All right. So 2017, I showed up here. Let's leave that world and let's work in college mental health. And I wanted to get used to John Marie, what's going on in college mental health, our thing. And I'm greeted with a bunch of stuff that looks like this. There's a terrible disaster in college mental health. It's a health crisis facing college students. And they have graphs like this. We actually participate in this survey that says sought counseling. And I'm like, so let's see, we have 40,000 students here more or less. That's what, 13,000 of them sought counseling. Why, our psychologists must be really busy. Took medications, so 20-some%, so that's what is that, 8,000 people? I'm gonna have an enormous caseload. How is that gonna work? 8,000, hospitalized 10%, really? 4,000 of our students have been hospitalized? We don't even have hardly any adolescent hospitalizations. Hospitals in existence for psychiatry. How did they all get in the hospital? What is that? Considered suicide. 12,000 of them? Well, even more concerning is attempted suicide. 4,000 students have tried to kill themselves. Like, shit, this looks like a real mess. That's just overwhelming. And even worse, all those lines go up, of course. And this is pre-pandemic. This is, 2011, 12, and 13 we're looking at. I wonder what's going on. Why are things so terrible for college students? You look, well, it appears every illness. Look, this is depression, this one, I think. Yeah. Here's, adults. Here's us older folks. And here's young people in college students. What the hell? Bipolar. All right, adults are going up. Look what's going on with teenagers and youth. ADHD, they're all going up. But every single illness is coincidentally having an epidemic at exactly the same time. All of our chemicals are going out of balance at the same time somehow. This is also from a giant college survey. I said, well, maybe it isn't all of them, because we look a little more carefully here. Schizophrenia, that's relatively flat. Drug abuse actually gone down a little. Bulimia is pretty flat. Anorexia is pretty flat. Even bipolar is flat. But look at these. Insomnia, ADHD, panic attacks, depression, anxiety. Those are careening terribly upwards. Up and up and up. They're getting more and more cases. Everybody's falling apart. And this is before the pandemic. So you're going to walk into a place where suddenly everyone's mental health is getting worse and worse and worse. What the hell is going on? I like looking for outliers or things that don't fit. Look at this graph. 12th graders, how happy are you? Now, first thing you'd notice, if you ever do a study like this, do not make a Likert with just 3 choices. Everybody chooses the middle one. This is not a good way to do your graph. It's going to make it hard to see things. But even given that, all those other graphs are going up dramatically. Why is this one going perfectly flat? Well, for one thing, the language is different. The others were asking, how's your illness doing? This one's asking how you're doing. The other one was asking how things wrong with you. Depression, anxiety, bulimia. This one's saying how happy you're. Changing your perspective changes whether we're in a terrible crisis or not. Maybe makes you wonder, how much is the crisis being caused by perceiving everybody in a medical way? The other thing on a college campus is the same as the outside in that the medical model is controlling all the strings. You can't, if you want to get accommodations or support in your class, you better not just be shy. You better have a generalized anxiety disorder. We don't give out pills for being shy. We don't give accommodation. You have to have a diagnosis. You want, when you want a dog in your apartment, your dorm room, you want an emotional support letter for that? You better not just be lonely. You better have a diagnosis of something. The medical lab controls whether you have a pet or not. You have trouble focusing in class and paying attention. If you want something else, you better have an attention deficit disorder, not that you're distractible. And if you want your family to lay off of you, it's good to have a diagnosis to say, it's not my fault, I'm depressed, I'm not lazy. Which, by the way, there's a subtle thing about there. Wait a minute, what happened to personal responsibility in here? Suddenly it's not your responsibility, you're building your life. It's, well, I have a depression, I have ADHD, I'm sorry, there's nothing I can do, you have to make allowances for me. I think a good deal of our families who say, I don't believe in mental illness, what they're really responding to is, I want my kid to stay responsible for their lives and not put it off to some other damn excuse. Don't give them that out. And the medical model too often says, your illness isn't your fault, there's nothing you can do, you just follow your treatment, and then you've been compliant, you're fine, we'll give you accommodation. Rather than, no, you still have to work hard at rebuilding the purpose in your life, the connections in your life, the places in your life, even harder because you've got these conditions, not it takes away your responsibility. But notice how you think, well, I'm not a doctor, it's not that much to do things. No, it's pervasive in all the stuff we do. Here's the pandemic. These are just random things I Googled up about the pandemic. Percent of adults showing symptoms of anxiety or depressive disorder. Wait a second. How do you know whether you're anxious or depressed because you're sad or nervous or stressed out or you have symptoms of a disorder? They just assumed all these people have disorders. Or, I was kind of bummed out by the pandemic, and I'm still kind of bummed out. Does that mean I've had a major depression for 2.5 years now? Same wording. I have symptoms of my anxiety or depression, or symptoms of a trauma stress-related disorder. So I'm stressed out. I have symptoms of a disorder. By the way, this one is interesting, goes with it, makes you wonder. This is how likely you have symptoms of a disorder at different ages. Well, look, this pandemic is really worse for young people. Is it really worse for young people, or are people willing to answer that question if you're young, because we've taught them to think in terms of diagnosis? My dad lives in a supported living for old people, they're all like in their 80s and shit. They were all in terrible shape with the pandemic. Bunch of them even stopped living there, afraid they're gonna die, and some did. But if you'd ask them, do you have symptoms of a depressive disorder or an anxiety disorder? Of course these 80-year-olds are gonna say no. How much of these lines are because we're carefully teaching them to express everything in terms of symptoms of a disorder? Is that really important, or am I just being a pain in the ass? This isn't just a word thing and you word police and politically correct or some shit. I maintain if you come and say, everybody's taught to say, I'm anxious and depressed, you lose this wonderful individuality, heterogeneity, richness of emotional expression. You lose who you are. You lose the emotions of your own journey, your own expressions. You know, can you imagine now trying to write one of those, romantic literature things, that we had to read in class way back in English lit, if the only thing you could say was, Jane Eyre got a depression, or somebody was anxious or something. You can all this richness of drama of human life, we're sucking it out by medicalizing it for our people. And we're making, instead of the process of listening and sharing your experience and compassion and empathetic with what you're going through emotionally, we're doing a diagnostic assessment and say, I've been struggling with a depression. We even teach them this for each other. How many students have you seen who come and say, oh, my girlfriend or my roommate, they're dealing with mental health issues and I'm trying to help them with their mental health issues. They don't say, I'm a friend going through stuff with them. All the nuance, all the individuality is being leaked out of it. This is one of Jim's slides, and I included because I like the point, even though I don't actually see things very much in decolonization. I'm not big on let's decolonize mental health. But actually, a lot of people in this college are thinking of that particular metaphor. And a lot of our students are actually living that. We've got tons of international students, we've got tons of immigrant children and children of immigrants, they immigrated themselves, who have actually have felt the colonial effects of our mental health system. So, but let me illustrate it with two stories of my own, since I can't imitate Jim. First one is about the indigenous wisdom part. So in, what was it, 1999, I got to spend a few weeks in New Zealand, looking at mental health things, doing a few presentations. And New Zealand is populated by mostly people from England, who ended up there. There's not that many people there, actually, more sheep than people. And they're kind of uprooted, they don't have much grounding there. And they're a little island far from everywhere. And so there are some indigenous people, the Maori people there. And so in the same way we sometimes do these business of, land gratitude things, or the thing we connect to our indigenous people, that's a big thing there of, can we borrow some of the groundedness from the indigenous people from the Maori, because you've got these displaced, English people on an island all the way across the world. And I saw two things that go with this. One is, so the Maori people have a concept, you ground yourself in three ways. You've got your home mountain, your home water, it could be a lake or river or the ocean, and your home ancestral house where your ancestors are. And indeed, this is like their community meeting hall, and it even looks like a person with a head on the one side and feet, and this is where your ancestors lived in the graveyard, and you continue on this is where I'm from. This is your tradition where you're from. And so I was in Wellington, which looks a lot like San Francisco. And there's these, a bunch of runaway youth there and people on trouble with drugs and homeless and wandering around. And so they built, helping themselves, ancestral home, the word is a Marathi, for themselves, but they didn't have one back home. They lost their own roots for whatever reason. They built it out of junk they found at the shipyards, and the place is just whopper junk. I don't know how it meets any safety criteria. You know, every wall is all these weird, they stick out and then just out in the room here and there. It's very strange. But what's really cool about this building is the way it welcomes people, and this is your new home. This is your home away from home. This is a place you belong. If you have nowhere, this is, you can ground your life here. And when I was there, this guy comes by. They apparently hadn't seen him for months. He's terribly dirty, finding all this thing. They looked at me like a heroin addict. And what I loved about him was the way they greeted and welcomed him home. Oh, come on in. It's great. We haven't seen you in so long. You want a hot shower? Let's get a big close up to eat and stuff. We haven't seen you. It's great. Not a bunch of judgment of why you messed up. How come you screwed up last night and missed 3 appointments? You can't come back. You're this. No, what you're welcome. This is always your home. You can always come back to it. As you're trying to make spaces, we'll get to in college for people to feel home who don't have a home. Your Rainbow Cafe over there, Lauren. The Latinas at the beach, the sisterhood. Is this indigenous, we make a home, a place that you can build from, feel safe, that you belong with, always welcome back no matter what you've done. We make more of those gathered around. The other story from there was something called the Day of Remembrance. And this is a young woman, she's all depressed and messed up, and she takes her canoe out in the paddle and she goes out in this little bay. And she sees in the muck and the leaves and the stuff under the water, there's like an old doll of hers. From a child. Well, how do you get here, take it out and lovingly remembers what it looks like and cleans it up, puts it in her boat? Goes a little further, finds some other, remember, wait, this is the paddle my dad used to whip me with. And but lovingly, let me, even if it's some bad memory, let me clean it up, let me bring it back. Here's and these all these memories of things from her life that she's been pushing aside, until she had nothing left of her life. She one at a time, she brings them back into her boat, cleans them off lovingly, accepts them back as part of her. Until she gets back around the shore, and now she has a boat full of her own life to be able to live a whole life. She's recovered these things for herself. I tell a lot of students this story is that you've been through a lot of stuff. You can't just pretend they didn't happen to live aside. You're going to be more and more empty, got no energy left, and you bring them on board. Those are both indigenous wisdoms, and many of our people are from cultures, all kinds of things. How would you do things? We respect that more. On the opposite side, the effect of colonizing with the medical model. I was in China for a couple months in the mid-80s. This is way when the first people going to China, they're wearing Mao suits, it's all rural stuff. They were talking about barefoot doctors. They don't have a bunch of professionals there at all at the time. Especially in rural China, got these people, they do a 2-week training program and give them a little book to go out there. And the mental health is, well, tell them they have depression and anxiety. And none of the people think they have depression and anxiety. None of these rural people think, no, I don't have, I'm not crazy, I don't have any mental health. Maybe my chi isn't so good. Maybe my ancestors are doing something. Maybe my yin and yang is out of balance. Maybe my stomach hurts, but I don't got no anxiety or depression. I'm not crazy. So they taught them how to teach people, no, that's somatization. That's what way. So here's some modern way of looking. Look at this DSM, look at this IDC-9. We've got diagnoses for these. Let me psychoeducate you so you understand these are symptoms of mental illness. And they gradually get people to accept this more and more. The most popular diagnosis, strange enough, was neurasthenia, which is an ICD but not DSM, which means weak nerves. At least it doesn't mean you're crazy, it just means you feel repressed and weak. Which, by the way, a lot of our students after pandemic have started with that one. But as it kept going, people stopped. Oh, by the way, they also had some other weird syndromes, like there was this thing for men that their genitals started shrinking and their testicles went back up into their bodies. Like, but after they start teaching them enough, things like that stopped happening, and people start talking about anxiety and depression. I understand how it is. And another, as it kept going on, they started experiencing their distress in those ways. They started coming with the standard set of depression, anxiety symptoms, and then understanding what they're suffering in terms of, I am depressed, I'm anxiety. They taught them to experience their distress in these medicalized ways. We've taught a whole generation to experience their distress in these medicalized ways. And it's a colonial effect. We spread that around the world and think everyone else backwards doesn't believe it. If nothing else, what's terribly wrong with this is it ignores trauma. There is no such thing as trauma in the DSM except PTSD, which is the results of trauma, not the cause of trauma. The flashbacks and nightmares. ACEs study is from middle-class white people in San Diego. What happened in your childhood? You know, did your parents split up? Did one of them die? They had mental illness? Was there domestic violence? You know, was there terrible disruptions in your childhood? And it turns out that how many ACEs you have, how many of these childhood adverse events, dramatically predicts what happens in your life. Not just you anxious or depressed, but do you finish school? Do you, how much money do you make? You end up, it impacts whether you have heart disease more than your weight or your cholesterol. It explains like 2/3 of the alcoholism, 3/4 of all drug abuse and suicide, as well as the physical things. How much you struggle with things in childhood. Many of you probably read Vanderhook's book, The Body Keeps Its Score, about trauma. He tried desperately for decades to get them to put childhood developmental trauma disorder into the DSM. Failed miserably, and the responses were, that doesn't really fill any missing diagnostic niche. We don't need that. We've got depression, anxiety, and PTSD, and generalized anxiety. We'll fit it in some other way. We don't need that. And besides, quote, the notion that early childhood adverse experiences lead to substantial developmental disruption is more clinical intuition than a research-based fact. Well, yeah, what about that research? The vast majority of what's going on comes from childhood trauma, people we struggle with the most. Just leaving that out alone disables the entire system. So I'm going to go through some examples of things we can do in college or that I've done or seen that are on this way of doing things. We're going to go through these half a dozen things. And before I do, let me do another pause here. Anything about the effect of the that we're living in a medical model in college mental health that we think we are or not, and how it's profoundly affecting things, and that eliminates the ability to see trauma or indigenous things to be able to help people. Any questions about any of that? Go.
Just a comment.
Go.
I was listening and say, the ICD codes just encourage that because that's what insurance works, right? An actual diagnosis.
So for the group over there, she says, doesn't the ICD codes that give you reimbursement for your insurance out in the real world, you don't feel insurance, you're out in the real world, doesn't that just make the whole thing more powerful and worse? Absolutely, that's one of their #1 tools. If you want to have help, you better have a diagnosis or we're not going to pay you. Being able to dominate that and refusing to put developmental trauma into with a book that you can get paid for cripples the entire outside, or not cripples, it distorts. This is one of their main weaponry in this domination. I feel like my Star Wars. That is just huge. Which, by the way, leads to wonky solutions like you're better off with capitated funding according to social risks and these various need things and stuff like this, which turns out we need to do it to free ourselves from that system. But those are, you know, how many of us are really interested in shit like that? All right, let's do one at a time. Anybody ever heard of emotional CPR? Anybody ever heard of mental health first aid? Bunch of nodding. Anybody ever heard of QPR? Better heard of QPR. We do it here. So the foundation with both mental health first aid and QPR are medical model systems. They teach you the amount of the stress you're feeling, your suicidal thoughts. There may well be a mental illness underneath this. Don't be embarrassed about that. Everybody could have it. Don't feel stigmatized. Let me help you, persuade you that you should get some help. Come see a professional, and they will help you deal with this. Assuming we have appointments left for the 12,000 people who want therapy. Both of them are set up like that. What would a recovery alternative look like? This is emotional CPR. It's made up by Dan Fisher. This is another voice of experience. Dan Fisher was an MD, PhD student at Harvard when he was doing brain research on the chemicals in your brain, and he got more and more isolated, more and more thinking, I don't have any free will or emotions, I'm just determined by my chemicals, and he became totally catatonic and couldn't move and got stuck in a psych hospital, diagnosed with psychosis, schizophrenia, did worse and worse. Until he decided, wait a minute, I'm not just a product of my chemicals, I do have a will, I do have emotions, I need connections to other people, and I need to look at this as an emotional experience I'm going through, I need help from other people who've been through this to get out of it. This is his drawing, which I've copied carefully, his artistic abilities. We were presenting one day together, and he put this on a napkin. And I love it just because of the gut feeling. The guy there who's sitting there thinking to himself, talking to himself, and this feeling going around, he's in a hole. I just put someone else there with him, and suddenly you're talking to someone else, your thoughts are going with someone else, your feelings with someone else, you make this human connection, which he believes is fundamental how he recovers, by making human connection. So emotional CPR is not built on diagnosis. It's built on things like trauma recovery, or things like after 9/11 things, about peer support principles that says, no, if you're going to help somebody else, encourage them to share their emotions with you, and you share back so the feelings go up and back. Instead of I'll help you, or I'll figure out, I'll tell you what to do. Empower them. No, let's sit together. I believe you're going to be able to do this when you'll be able to come up with this stuff. I'm going to share my own experiences as a way of connecting with you, rather than saying, no, I'm a professional, I keep a distance. I believe that you're already well enough to come up with this. You have the power in you to recover already. You don't need to be fixed with some other way. And I'm going to try to avoid labeling you with things, and you don't need professional training to do this. And I'm going to use normal human language rather than clinical terms. Notice the responsibility of staying with the person in distress, but I'm here creating a relationship that brings out the best in you. When we want to do our trainings out there for college students, we have a choice of the ones we're doing now, which are illness centered, and say we need more appointments and people come to see us more to fix all these epidemics. Or we can say, can you get better being friends for each other? Not miniature doctors or caseworkers or therapists, but you be better friends and connecting and having relationships with each other and helping people come with their own solutions and never have to see us in the first place. A different approach to that campus education piece. This is active minds. And I want to show both, because I like this group, we have one on campus, but also how the medical model has usurped it. So this picture here is something called the Send Silence Packing Group. Each of those backpacks is someone who killed themselves or someone who survived a suicide attempt. You go and read the little cards, the story of the stuff. And the backpacks is we carry this weight silently ourselves, open up these stories so other people can hear to open it up. It's a group project, to demonstrate the things going on. And let me spend a second here to show you a little video. Actually, let me tell you one thing about it. So this group started, there was a student at Princeton who got pretty depressed and suicidal, and he went to the student health, got some treatment. They had him disconnect from college to take a withdrawal. He went home, he went through another couple of years up the back of where his treatments weren't working too well and stuff, and then killed himself. Never got to return to college. His younger sister said, what the hell just happened to my older brother who I looked up to and stuff? Did it have to be that way? Did it have to be, was that really the best? Did it have to leave this life? What else is possible? And she's devoted herself to this group that's got these 500 campus staffers, including our own. Once again, this is the voice of lived experience, in this case, of a family member. Jed Foundation is also a family member. All right, let me see if I can click on here for the YouTube of listening to the sister.
Hi, I'm Allison Allen. Since 2003, Active Minds has worked tirelessly to amplify the stories of young adults who are struggling with their mental health, and to let everyone know that no matter what you're going through, you're not alone, it's not your fault, and hope is available. Until now, Santana's Packing his travel as an immersive experience that aims to jumpstart action in communities across the country. The exhibit's backpacks carry with them the stories of loved ones lost to suicide and stories of survival. And here, we're going beyond the backpacks. Through this digital exhibit, you will hear directly from both people who've lost loved ones and suicide attempt survivors. You'll get a peek into the kind of culture that we envision this world moving toward, as well as resources to help you take action in your own community to change the conversation about mental health. We invite you to add your voice to create a chorus of hope, to let others know that they're not alone by answering one question. What would you say to someone who's struggling? For me, I would say what my brother Brian needed to hear 20 years ago before he died by suicide. What you're going through doesn't define you. I'm here to help you get through this. Thank you for taking time to explore our exhibit. For all of us in Active Minds, we're so glad you're here.
I love that. That's back to my definition of recovery base. It's amplifying the experience. It's strength space. The illness doesn't just define you. Sharing and connections, peer support, emotional CPR. And I'm not. This is not to criticize our group here. This is to point out the power of the medical model or the empire. This is our Active Minds before the pandemic. Their list of meetings. I went to one of the meetings. Look how it's turned into a list of illnesses: eating disorders, schizophrenia, drug and alcohol, self-care, autism. It's been totally usurped from the original intention of the people who set it up. And look around, how many of our programs have been usurped in this sort of way? And we look at the giant new plan. How many of those things are medical model? How many between made persons on a recovery base instead? So instead of the medical model, I want a developmental model. It says we're not loaded with a bunch of neurochemical imbalances, a bunch of serotonin and things that needs to be triggered. These illnesses aren't the cause of our distress. They're the result of our distress. I'm not depressed because I have a depression. That's its round thinking. Stuff happened and that made me depressed. Depressed is the outcome, not the cause. I don't have a generalized anxiety disorder causing me to be anxious. I had a bunch of life experiences and an inherent shyness that caused me to feel anxiety and develop this disorder. These are the outcomes. And sometimes we get stuck. And the more we get stuck, the more we develop these symptoms. Suffering isn't meant to be just eliminated and let's stop and get you just had a terrible breakup and you're depressed and you can't sleep and you have nightmares and all this stuff, feel terrible about yourself. So let me give you some pills to get rid of this. Your mom just died and you're gonna lose your house for COVID and you're gonna let me just pills get rid. No. What can we learn from our suffering? How can we value our suffering? How do we grow from it? Not how do we eliminate it? As a paradigm developmentally perfect. Here's what I share with students about this. So you guys have probably seen this thing of Winnie the Pooh, where they diagnose all the characters, and Tinker has ADHD and Eeyore's depressed and that Rabbit's anxious and Pooh has an eating disorder. And here they even say Christopher Robin has schizophrenia because he's imagined it. Wonderful. I found the source of this. It's a Canadian Medical Association journal. And they suggest that characters are better off with psychoactive drugs and more parental guidance. And this is a quote. They're not just making fun anymore. We cannot but wonder how much richer Pooh's life video had a trial of low-dose stimulant medication. Now let's think about Christopher Robin for a minute. And I don't know this story perfectly. It's like a 100-year-old story. His mom isn't around for some reason. She's dead or something. They live in a manor house. His dad is like an English professor. I understand that his dad is like pissed that he's famous for these children's books instead of this serious English literature stuff. And back in then, serious English professors don't play with their kids. So the kid is there playing by himself. But the dad's sensitive enough to write these books. So he's not like a bad guy. And what Christopher Robin is doing is he's working out these various parts of himself creatively to make them a whole. And what makes Pooh special is that in every adventure, everybody gets to come as they are. Nobody says, ER, cheer up before you come along. Tigger, stop bouncing before you come. Owl, stop being so narcissistic and arrogant before you come along. And everyone contributes to every adventure. It's back to the Bay of Remembrance with the Maori woman. All these pieces of him that he's projecting and playing with and working through, he's creating and working through, become a whole. Instead of saying, I got to get rid of my depression or treat my anxiety, how does that contribute to who you are and how can you build it in? Or in a campus level, every time something terrible happens around here, some shooter, somebody dies, somebody kills himself, something happens, we send out a small army of CAP psychologists out there to process the incidents, to help you work through things, and somebody try to give extra support. We are the largest public arts college on the West Coast. Why don't we send an army of artists, of dancers, of creative filmmakers, of animators, of stuff? Why aren't we coming up with community healing things like backpacks and like AIDS quilts instead of psychologicalizing everything? Why aren't we integrating this as part of our community now that suicide is part of what happened? How do we memorialize? How do we remember? How do we include this? Not how do we psychologically process this within, I can only do this when I'm out there and I can do this back in my office with the structures. Why can't it be a more creative, artistic putting things together? Now, if you update this, who is 100 years ago, to Toy Story, this is my theory. The dads now are different. These dads in Toy Story are not like college professors. These dads are like animators at Pixar. You can picture them playing around with their kids all the time. And they write themselves. We have the same characters, by the way. Notice got all those same things going on. But this time they write themselves into the story as the dad. Woody is the dad. Woody, you know, he knows his son thinks he's special and the closest one, but he knows also has to move on and not get jealous and let others take his place, and they're going to grow up beyond. He helps the other parts not feel so bad about themselves while they encourage everybody. He doesn't take over. He tries to make everybody have missions and do things together as various things happen in life going along. Once again, playing with growing up, and they're very touching, these movies. Well, at least 1, 2, and 4, 3. But anyway, if you get all the way to 4, you get to this character, Forky. For those of you who haven't gotten to that far, I'd recommend it. Skip 3 and do 4. So 4 begins with the toys are now with a little girl because the boy has gone off to college, and she's like starting kindergarten. And they give her a pile of craft supplies to make something with, to make things with it. And some little bully little kid takes and dumps the box on the ground and leaves her crying. And Woody helps out by getting the box back out for her and make something. And she cheers up a little and she starts making things. And she puts together this thing. And she loves it. This is her character. That's my favorite story. This character, though, when he comes alive, he keeps throwing himself in the trash can. He thinks he's trash. The whole movie, so he jumps in the trash can, and Woody kicks, "You're not trash. Get back out of here. She loves you. You're special." Over and over and over and over again. The last scene is she's now moved on to first grade or whatever beyond this, where they're making things, and she makes a little girl out of the spooning, who comes to life and jumps in the trash can too. Except this time, instead of Woody saying it, Forky says, no, get out of the trash can. We're not trash, even though we might feel that way. But how did it, so I don't know how it worked. It's magical kind of like just value. She cares about value stuff worth something important. Why do I care about this character? Because I think it's the emblematic character of the time of our students. They are being forced to invent themselves out of scraps. They're not going to just follow in the jobs of their parents, and the religions of their parents, and the country of their parents, and the gender identities of their parents, and the foods, and the sexual practice, all kinds of stuff. They keep inventing out of just scraps. And if by some miracle they put together some living version of themselves, here, I've got an identity, as often or not, they think it's trash. They think they're no good and worthless. I got to keep working on it on my social media and sort of make it perfect, and it's no good. And us as the adults are not doing a good job of helping them out of the trash over and over again. You are magical just the way you are. even if you think you're made out of pieces of trash. That's the actual developmental journey our students are on. Is on making themselves out of pieces of leftovers, because we stole all the money, all the jobs, all the housing, and left them with scrap to try to build a life. At least we owe them to celebrate their creations and their self-identities, rather than to tell them, you guys are shit. This next set of slides is from Jim. And I want to make and he made this point really powerful, otherwise I put them in there and I'll try to think along with it. If you believe this idea that most of the time is what's going on with these people is a bunch of trauma. And when they're suicidal, it's because this trauma is overwhelming them, the protective factors are gone, they can't handle things anymore, I just can't handle life anymore, I'm done. If they're in that spot, the amount we traumatize or soothe or protect them matters an enormous amount. We need to look at our interventions through a trauma lens. How are they seeing us as someone who's understanding and soothing and protective, or someone who's re-traumatizing and telling them they're no good? We put a bunch of stats that are worth looking at. The lifetime risk for suicide is highest in the 2 weeks when you get out of a psych hospital. You come and say that you're suicidal, we put you in a hospital, you get terribly traumatized and scared and overwhelmed by the thing, you say you're stop suicide, don't get yourself out, they don't make any reasonable discharge plans, you've learned never tell anybody else about suicide, they're going to do that to you again. You're more isolated than you started with, you got to get rid of those meds that are making you so groggy, drugged up, that gave you the hospital, and now you're really behind on your classes and stuff too. That 2 weeks is the biggest risk. Super important for the CARES group, especially. How much you perceive the hospitalization as coercive matters a lot in how traumatized with it. Was it voluntary, involuntary? Were there handcuffs? Who took you there? How much did you agree? How much didn't you? All those variations matter. Even if you have to do it, can you give them as little coercion, as much control as possible? Relevant for the social workers now. Please, this is the part that convinced Damien you guys need to hear it. Afterwards, as I just said, they just won't talk about suicide anymore. Now they're isolated. They're back to the picture where you're on yourself, talking to yourself. By the way, no data about trauma. If you have ACEs as high as A score, you have a 3,000 to 5,000% increase of suicide. Weird implication here, by the way, which I've thought of but never done. We sometimes do around here some screenings for depression, anxiety scales. As though we're going to pick up people who are suicidal or in great need like that in our primary care clinic. What if we did ACEs as our screening? Maybe how much childhood trauma you've been through is more predictive than all our symptom checklists. Even over on the CAP side, we've got like a 62 questionnaire. We don't actually ask the 8 questions that are on the ACEs on that questionnaire. We ask what your symptoms are. We don't ask what you've been through. This is even psychosis. If you've had, if there's a trauma, the more likely you're psychotic. It's 7 times as likely to be psychotic. It's not just a biological condition, even what we call psychosis. If you start ending up going to hospitals over and over again for suicide, you get broken down, spirit breaking along the way. This happens a lot on these intersecting identities because you're the same colonial place. You can't accept how they're looking at it yourself. It makes it worse and worse. So there's an urgent need to change suicide things from, let's see what's wrong with your chemicals, let's see what's going on with the distress and that's going on from the power and what's going on in your life. So what he recommends for suicide intervention, number one thing he thinks campuses need is if you're feeling suicidal, have someone with lived experience who's been there, who's tried to kill them as suicidal, give you a space to be able to connect and explore those feelings in the meeting in a non-judgmental way, but more and more like the picture of the ECPR one where you're connecting like that, instead of someone doing a safety evaluation and seeing whether you need to go to a hospital and make plans, or maybe in addition. But that what you really need is a space to be able to begin to pull out of that blackness. Our campus doesn't hardly anyone, to be fair, offers that. You're suicidal. Let me have someone who's been there, who's been suicidal, sit with you to help you just think things through in a safe, non-judgmental way with someone that's been there. Should be on our menu. Then you have to hire people for it to do like that. And if you did that, maybe you'd see some trauma healing as a result in that moment, rather than seeing this about something terrible might happen, a deficit phase. See that crisis is when most recovery occurs. This might be the opening to begin healing. All right, how about me? Psychiatric services and medications. I'm going to hear bad mouthing the medical model over and over again. Aren't I a doctor? Aren't I handing out pills? What the hell? How am I supposed to do this? Is there a way to be a doctor and hand out pills that's developmental, strengths-based, collaborative, and person-centered? Here's what I've got. When I see someone, my first introduction, after telling them I'm short-term and won't see you very often, the next thing I tell people is we live in a very medical model area. We talk a lot about diagnoses and DSM and chemical imbalances and pills to stabilize your chemistry and genetic predisposition and stuff like that. And don't get me wrong, there's some usefulness in all that biology. But I tend to take a more developmental approach with you guys. That you're born with whoever you are. You've got your strengths, your weaknesses, your talents, your temperament. You're even born with a blueprint for your growth and development. Comes in the factory packaging in your DNA. And then life happens. Sometimes it's warm, supportive stuff and you blossom and grow. Sometimes it's really traumatic stuff and you end up bent and broken and bruised and twisted and growing in ways you never expected to or never wanted to. Notice even the trauma is a growth opportunity. Lots of times it's both supportive in some ways and traumatic in other ways. Almost every student nods at that point. And they're starting to feel understood now, not them like checklist, they're understood. Hey, he gets how things go. And sometimes you're coming in because you're stuck. You're not growing and going anymore. You're like in mud now, or you're pounding your head against the wall. We need to look at, what needs to change in your life to help you get unstuck. Maybe this major isn't working. Maybe you're always imagining a doctor and you can't get past organic chemistry. What needs to change? What needs to change in how you're looking at your life? Maybe some ways of feeling better or coping things or doing things. Maybe even some meds to feel better beyond stuff so you can go back to grow and develop into the person you're meant to be. I'm not that concerned with trying to figure out what's going on with biochemistry of some part of your brain that I don't know if you've got a test for anyway. I'm interested in trying to get you back on track and growing into the person you're supposed to be. And then, 20 years from now, you can have some other problem with your family or your boss or the planet burning down or something. And you can have to go through this all over again, but at least you'll know what you're doing, so it'll be easy. That the pills are about getting unstuck, not about treating and diagnosis. And let's talk about the story of how you got stuck in the first place. Developmental models can use pills. You're not depressed because you have a disorder, it's because something happened. First, you grew up in a certain way, but let's talk about what happened that got you stuck right now. And by far the most common things I see around here are the causes of getting stuck. Number one is relationship breakups. I think it'll always be number one. I almost ended up fucking out of college and not getting to be a doctor because of, it wasn't even a relationship breakup. It was someone I wanted to have a relationship that didn't want to break up. That's super common, both because you lost them, you lost a part of yourself that they brought out, you lost your dreams and imaginations of what it was going to be, you lost the confidence that you're going to be able to have a better marriage than your parents. What's happened? There's a lot of implications from the shattering your life from the breakup. Second one is broken dreams. We've got a lot of competitive things around this school. Like some people get to be in the BFA program, some get the BA program. Some people get a scholarship for basketball, and some get to be bench warmers. Some people get to be in the performance groups for music. Some people get to be in the interior design, industrial design. Some just a regular design program. Some get to go from the nursing pre-nursing to nursing, and some don't. Every time we have a competitive like that, some people didn't get the better thing. And many of those people may have been taught, if you want something bad enough and you know what you want to do and you work hard, you can do anything. Not only did they not get their dream, they got their worldview shattered, that they're capable of getting their dreams. Now they're helpless and then broken. What do I do? We're creating piles of people with that. Your dreams are growing and they're further and further away from what your family wants for you or imagined for you. This can be a religious thing. I grew up, in a God-fearing household, and now I want to have sex, or I no longer believe in the Bible, or I don't think of this, of that. This can be a gender thing, a sexual identity thing. This can be an immigration thing. This can be even something like my parents want me to be a nurse and I want to be a filmmaker thing, and they think it's not practical thing. This wasn't the problem 100 years ago. 100 years ago, you didn't make your life out of those scraps. 100 years ago, you just did whatever your parents told you to do. You lived in the same place, you had the same religion, you had the same gender roles, you married somebody who they picked out down the street for you, you did the same coal mining job as your dad. You just did this. You raised kids the same way, women did certain, men did certain, and you just did this. You didn't have to figure this stuff out. This creates a lot of neurasthenia of repressed people. But it's much easier, and you can actually get a nice head start. My grandparents managed to start their lives at 15 like this. I started having kids and it went really badly. So, because they were immigrants and weren't actually from. Nowadays, we say you should be able to follow your own passions, grow your own thing. But that's not likely to be in accordance with what your parents want necessarily. And you have a certain choice at a point. You might going to actually do what my parents want. You tell me I have to be independent, but as a Chinese, I'm supposed to take care of my parents as the oldest daughter. And you're telling me to do this independent thing when that's not what I'm supposed to be doing. Or are you going to start splitting? I got two selves. I act one way about my parents and a different way. I don't tell them that I'm gay. I wear a whole different things. I pretending for years with them on the stuff, and I have a whole different life over here. And the more you do that, the two lives start splitting. More and more are going to be torn in half, and this one isn't going to grow. And this one's going to keep changing, and you get more and more torn. Or you can abandon them entirely, go on your own way, and then lose a whole bunch of protective factors and a whole bunch of connections and love and what family supports can be, and just have to make it on your own. A lot of them are going through some version of those three choices. I tell them these are the choices, and this is why you're struggling. Your comfort zone isn't big enough for your dreams. We've got a lot of people who are a little bit shy or anxious for some reason. Maybe it was trauma, they had an alcoholic dad. Maybe they're just, we're always a shy person. They're anxious. Maybe they grew up in a small town. Maybe they just take after their mom. And now they have a dream that says you have to do group projects. You have to do public speaking. You have to go to a nursing ward and speak up and do 20-page, 100-page plans about things and present them to people and have it ripped apart. And they go, well, you have to do presentations and things. And this is more than I'm too shy for that. I'm too anxious for that. We see a lot of people who have dreams that are bigger than their comfort zone. Are you going to lower your dream, or are you going to have to do something to build your comfort zone that you can have your dream? Sexual assault, relationship-based, is super common. And I don't mean just like the rapes from some stranger. I mean one that says, you told me if I followed the rules and took precautions, then a guy would respect me. And if I said no, it'd be no, and it didn't work out that way. Once again, not only was I traumatized and damaged, but my worldview was shattered. Now I don't feel safe anymore. Now I can't be around any event. I can't go to class. And I'm approaching graduation, and I don't know what I'm going to do next with my life. I'm not ready for adult things and stuff. I don't got it together. I don't have money. I don't have a job. I don't know what I'm doing. All I really know how to do is go to school. Back expressing things in normal language. And so what do you, these things are going to get meds for that? So that way you're getting meds for shyness now? I actually talked about this one already. This is the one about writing your own life, like about the 14, building your own stuff. All right, so I'll get back to meds in a second. We can help them with the changing these struggles into an opportunity for growth. All right, your dream got broken, you lost this relationship, you were great things happen. How are you going to turn that into something positive? How are you going to incorporate it into your Winnie the Pooh group? How are you going to bring it back in your community? How are you going to make meaning out of your suffering? One of the first things I used to ask people when they came before we started the pandemic, I said, you know, I'm kind of new at this school, it's a big place, and I'm stuck in this little office. Tell me something about this school, just something you've been through, some club or some class or anything. Now, this is a good thing for not being a power differential, so not feeling comfortable and find what's going on. But the really powerful thing is, whatever they tell me is usually the strength side of whatever their wound is. They'll say, I'm studying exobiology. I'm like, what the hell is exobiology? Oh, it's looking for life in outer space. This is a person who felt she would never really belong. She must have been like from someplace else. It wasn't part of her family, didn't really connect. Person comes and says, oh, I'm studying macroeconomics to predict recessions. This is someone who, when the giant recession came, their dad lost their job, their mom turned to alcohol, fell apart, had to leave the family, and all crumbled, fell apart, and they want to be able to predict so it'll never happen to them again, so they can be safe from that trouble. Yes, there's also people who want to be social workers and nurses and school counselors to help people who, like me, because no one helped me, or I learned things what they need to help, and yes, there's a lot of positivity of that. I want to prevent this suffering. I'll ask, so you had an alcoholic dad and was kind of bouncing around. Lots of people have that. Develop kind of a sixth sense. They know how other people are feeling, or so people aren't feeling, know who's disturbed with what's in the room. Did you get that as an extra gift from this, that you kind of know what all your friends are feeling or stuff like this? If you have a really depressed mom who's like suicidal and out there and they're around stuff, sometimes you learn how to be very attentive to other people's needs. Sometimes you don't take care of your own as a result, but if you notice, you can really help other people because you can pick up on their needs because you got that extra ability along the way. Not did you grow in some certain special way, did you get a gift for these wounds? The core gift concept, you want to look at my friend Bruce Anderson's helped young people find their gifts. And as often as not, they're connected to a wound, both that your gift keeps pushing you to bash yourself in the wall. And when I was trying to deal with this, I developed skills and found things about myself that made me the person I am today. And what role models or mentors do you have? The pictures here are Rachel Redmond, a small advertisement. This is a role model for me. She's actually like 84 years old now. She was like, there was like 9 doctors in her family, and she knew everyone was going to become a doctor, so she would have to come. But she also had Crohn's disease. So she had terrible stomach pains, and she needed a bunch of surgery. She had an ileostomy when she was 27, taking out her gut and made a bag for the rest of her life. So when she went to medical school, she'd been a patient way more than she'd been a doctor. So all the normal stuff we do bugged the shit out of her. And she decided that what most people do not need is a doctor who's perfect coming from a point of expertise. I need to learn more and more so I never make any mistakes. What they need is someone who really understands you and is compassionate and is a human in their own weaknesses. And as often as not, the source of your compassion is going to be your own weaknesses, and that'll make you a wounded healer. In her life, she's done 2 things. One is she does these 2-week retreats for people who are diagnosed with cancer when they're first diagnosed, to come to terms with it personally, socially, family, spiritually, before you even start your chemo study. And 2-week retreats for doctors who feel like they're not helping anymore and they become burnt out. She teaches classes to medical students on the art of healing, on what are the moments that are actually healing, about listening, not about using your expertise to figure out something diagnosed. I tell that story a lot to our students who are social workers and nurses and pre-meds who are feeling have problems themselves, and say, you want to become, not you get rid of this bad part, how are you going to turn that into your source of compassion so it doesn't control you, but you can use it as your gift. These are a bunch of ways you can be stuck. After those things happen, you're on the phone all the time, you got no energy, can't do anything, can't pay attention. So where do meds fit in? Not, I have an illness, therefore I take the pill. My 3 Ds. One is, are you stuck in your development? You can't move forwards. I'm trying to be a filmmaker and I'm too anxious, so I can't talk to anybody. I can't move forward. I can never get a date with this. I'm stuck at home with no energy because nobody will accept me as gay and I'm too scared to tell anybody. But your own dysfunction. I can't function. I can't pay attention to my classes. I can't get out of bed. I can't do things. And third is your distress. If you're not stuck, well, maybe not, because our goal is going to be how to get you unstuck and moving again. So when I describe antidepressants, I'll say I got 4 different kind of antidepressants. One decreases overthinking, going round and round and round negatively, which can make it hard to sleep and depressed and anxious and panicky and have trouble your body image and stuff like this. One of these makes it so you're feeling dulled, your whole body is slow, you're in mud, you have a vegetated depression, you can't move, the weight of the world on you. One of these is a stimulating antidepressant to give you energy out of bed, motivated to do things like caffeine does, kind of. And one of these is about being able to sleep at night so you're not all tired all the time and getting all these nightmares and stuff you can find. Do any of those sound like you that help you get unstuck to move forward in your life? Notice the model here. I'm not making a diagnosis of an illness to treat. I'm asking, where did your life get stuck? I understand how you got here and what's happened. Would any of these things help you get unstuck to move forward? This is how you get off meds too, by the way. Is by, too many thoughts. Did I make the changes to move forwards? Was this a temporary thing like a breakup, or I've been anxious since I was 6 and I need to develop new ways of doing things? Might take me months or years to do it. You're using the meds to grow, not using treated illness. But I'm going to move on. Last one, I'll leave off this here thing. How we all fit in what a giant plan would look like that would be recovery based for the campus. We look at each student and say, where are you in your self-identity, in your relationships, what skills you got, and what resources and supports you have? Are you back here and I'm just barely exploring? I've never had a date or I'm going on my first date. Relationships, I'm exploring what's my gender identity. Am I really a physicist or an engineer? I'm just learning how to drive a car. I don't have a driver's license. I don't have any money. My folks pay for everything. I've never had a job. I'm starting to explore, I'm starting to learn and build these things. I learned some skills. I had some dates that went badly. I directed a play. I went to some conferences. I presented on my chemistry thing. I made some fashion things. I did a performance in jazz. And I got to go to Vienna. And I'm now getting it. So how's this going to apply to outside people? Notice how far away I've gotten from illness model, how this is person-centered, this is strengths-based, it's built on their goals, as collaborative, how they're moving, and how we all fit into this. The psychiatrist, all right, this is some pills can help these things get less. If a person learning wellness things, meditation is on, am I learning job skills? Am I the opera singer instructor? The whole idea of college is to help you grow in these ways, not to help you overcome these illnesses. The illnesses are a product of your development falling apart or getting stuck. We don't need to figure out how to treat all those various things with more clinics and more doctors and more hospitals. We need more helping people develop and grow and move, and the people can help them from a whole variety of places all working together. Various pieces scattered around campus. So I plead that instead of trying to find a medical model that'll work here using treatment and prevention and coping skills and wellness, to do things in the developmental recovery-based way to build this alternate base. Comments, questions, thoughts? Yeah.
One question. ACE's questionnaire in yours.
I don't hand them that as a piece of paper for an evaluation. but I almost always end up asking those questions along the way. Told us growing up, like, what were your parents like, were they around, was there violence with family? And at the end, I'll say, so was there either, we talked a lot about you, do you think I got the idea? Is there something else traumatic that happened that made it, that impacted you or changed your life trajectory? Or maybe something else good happened, some other mentor or something inspiring that happened to you that we haven't talked about yet. I know, obviously I don't understand you entirely in an hour, but did it build up? The question for the benefit of the Zoom people, I realize I did not repeat, is do I do an ACE questionnaire before I do the thing? And I incorporate that into the conversation rather than handing it out as a sheet, so it's more natural. And also then I'll learn interesting things about the details and things, not just, how did it happen?
Just a lot of gratitude is coming through the chat.
So in conclusion, I guess, my question when I came here 5 years ago was, does the stuff from the recovery model that I learned in the community, this stuff about strengths-based and person-centered growth and development and resilience and collaboration and peer voices of lived experience, does it have a relevance to what college students are going through? Does it have a relevance to how we should be organizing services there? Does it have relevance to how we should hand out medications? And my answer after 5 years is a resounding yes. I think this model has a much better chance of being able to address the overwhelming situations we find ourselves in, or they find themselves in, or together we're in. Then, I see other schools are hiring 11 new psychiatrists and we hospitalize somebody every other day. I don't think they're going to get their way out of it like that. I think these principles have a much better chance of working with my conclusion after being here. Thank you all both for being here today and for giving me a place to have a second home for the last 5 years and to connect with all of you and Sharon. You all taught me a great deal along the way. Let me play and help and experiment, do things. Thank you very much for the time here. I really appreciate it.